Okay, so we're going to do just a part 2 on the topic of grief in the recovery from Cptsd or relational trauma. A couple things that I want to add on to this topic, which I believe is incredibly important, is the first one is the grief that we experience in the healing from relational trauma has some similarities and some differences from, let's say, the grief of the loss or the death of a loved one. And one of the major differences is that when we are experiencing the grief related to the healing process and relational trauma, this grief is primarily incredibly private to the individual. So, somebody may be really going through this, experiencing this, and there may be very few people or no one knows that the individual is going through this. It's a very private process, obviously. In this kind of grief, there's no obituaries, there's no funerals, people aren't bringing meals over. A lot of people just aren't going to understand this. And so it's incredibly private by nature. Whereas the grief related to the death of a loved one can be very public, okay? And so some of the similarities, or the biggest similarity, is that just like grief from the death of a loved one, this is not a linear process. And so, the grieving process and relational trauma, it's going to be, we're going to move through the various stages of grief, and we're going to have days when we feel really good and we feel like the grief might be lifting a little bit. And we're going to have days where we feel incredibly sad and just a heaviness and a real darkness, okay? And then there's going to be days where both exist, okay? We have a lot of joy, we have a lot of beauty, we have a lot of goodness, a lot of color, and, there may also be just periods in that day of darkness or sadness, and we may need to cry and just feel that heaviness. So just wanted to speak on that for a moment. The other thing that I wanted to say here is, a lot of people, when they get to this, kind of near, I would say, towards the end stages of the grieving process in relational trauma, there's like a real urgency that folks will feel to make some very significant changes in their life. So they may understand that they've developed or they've created this life and this way of being in the world that is largely not theirs. It doesn't feel authentic to them anymore. It feels like there's a degree of fakeness to it. And so it is very natural for people to have an urgency to want to make some very significant changes. And I always like to work with people in this, in this period of time, and really encourage folks to just slow it down a little bit and to get really quiet and to just really be with themselves and to meditate and reflect and maybe journal and just kind of sit with a lot of the truths, a lot of the healing that's been done. This is, we can also call this an integration phase. All the different realities, objectives we might have learned about our family history. We now understand all the false or the negative beliefs that we've had about ourselves. And, we're beginning to understand who we authentically are. And we're just integrating all that information, okay? And listening and just being quiet during that period of time, pausing, is going to be really, really important before we jump into making any big decisions. And so, that's key here, okay? And so we might need to make some very big decisions, but there's real great value in some discernment here and pausing and just slowing the process down a little bit. And so what I do is I really encourage people during this period of time, instead of making some of those bigger decisions, is let's try to just really practice making smaller changes, smaller decisions. And so the way that I kind of lay this out for folks is, in every single day, we have many, many decision points, okay? These points where we ask ourselves, often unconsciously, what do I want right now? What do I need right now? So, sitting down to eat a meal, right? What do I want right now? Not what have I been programmed to eat because it's healthy and because it will allow me to maintain a certain figure so that I fit into certain clothes that is pleasing to other people. It's, what does my body want right now? What is my body craving right now? Really listening to that, okay? Do I want to put on a full face of makeup today? Or do I want to go makeup free today or light makeup today? It's getting out of our automatic responses, the routines that we've been just kind of programmed to, and stopping and pausing ourselves and asking ourselves, what do I want today? How do I want to wear my hair today? How do I want to wear makeup today? Do I want to wear makeup today? It's in those moments where somebody reaches out to us and they say, hey, do you have a moment? I need to talk about something difficult. It's pausing and saying, do I have the emotional energy right now to take that phone conversation? Or do I need to kind of put a boundary in place and just really, kind of stay to myself today and let them know that I'm unavailable? Do I want to accept that invitation to go out to that social event tonight? Or do I want to stay in? Do I want to just kind of be with myself? Do I want to exercise today? Do I want to do intensive exercise today? Or do I want to do something a little bit more gentle with my body? Do I want to take on that commitment for that sports team for my kid? Do I really want to do that? Do I have the time and energy to do that? Or am I saying yes out of guilt? So it's learning to pause before we make decisions throughout our day and asking ourselves, what do I want and what do I need? And then we begin to listen to that, okay? And that in and of itself is a huge part of this process in the healing from relational trauma, learning how to get quiet and listen to what we want, not what other people want us to do, not what society wants us to do, not, what our guilt is telling us we should do. It is, what do we want and what do we need? That's a very, very important part of this process, okay? So we go through this period of time where we're kind of getting creative, we're experimenting with what do we want, what do we need? Maybe we're doing some things differently. And in time, there are gonna probably, for many of us, there are some bigger changes that we need to make. And so some of these things that I see here in therapy, in real life with the people that I work with, is, sometimes there are relationships that have to end. And it, is often in kind of the case where it's a loving relationship. These two people love one another very much, but because of the reality that the individual's healing cannot continue while being in that relationship, maybe there's a degree of inauthenticity, maybe there's a degree of fakeness, maybe there is one or both partners that has a degree of wounding that needs to be addressed. Just this reality that we can't stay in this relationship anymore and be authentically ourselves. We can't be in this relationship anymore without abandoning a part of ourselves. That is a really hard decision that a lot of folks have to make in the healing process. And I would say the opposite is true as well. As many of us kind of engage in this healing process and we become more authentic in our relationships and we communicate that authenticity to our partner, we communicate these kind of maybe new wants and needs to our partner, it can actually blossom a relationship and really bring it to the next level, which can be incredibly beautiful to witness. Some of the other things that we may see here, people just decide, I don't want to go to that church anymore. I don't want to be a part of that religious institution right now. I don't feel comfortable. I don't feel safe. I don't feel authentic being in that religious service anymore. So they may take a break from attending religious services. And that may kind of continue for a period of time. They may want to try out other spiritual groups or offerings. We see friendships end. We grow out of friendships. There may be friendships where we don't feel like we can be authentic in them anymore. And so sometimes friendships end. We will often see people beginning to say no to volunteering, saying no to, to constantly being of service to others. And that is a very significant change that I see in a lot of women. And that's so important, is really learning how to begin to protect our energy and not just giving it and giving it and giving it, because that's what we've been programmed to do. That's where our worth comes from. And the other thing I will say is that for many of us, we look at the jobs that we're in, the careers that we're in, and it doesn't feel okay anymore. It doesn't feel authentic anymore. And so for some people, they make a decision to change careers or go back to school, or they're playing a different role. They want to play a different role in their organization. And so, you'll notice that a lot of these things are pretty big decisions, and they require, obviously, again, this degree of discernment, because, there are financial implications, there are family obligations that we obviously need to meet. And, we have to honor those things, okay? And so not making any kind of massive knee-jerk decisions in this process, but also not ignoring the fact that we may need to make some very big decisions. And there's a right way, there's a way of doing that from a place of integrity and authenticity. The other thing I want to note here is that for a lot of people during this period of time, they will, their appearance will change. So they may stop coloring their hair. They may stop doing their hair the way they've always done. Maybe they stop straightening their hair. They let their hair go curly. Maybe they stop wearing kind of the uniform that they've always worn to work and they start to be a little bit more casual. Maybe they wear colors they've never worn before, and so this can look a lot of different ways. And the last thing I want to say here is that, these changes, for the people around us that are kind of noticing these changes, small and big, they're observing it, it can make people pretty nervous. Like, it can really bring up a lot of insecurity in folks. It can bring up fear in folks. There can be a lot of judgments made. And so, especially with, like, I think about women pulling back from like constantly being of service to others, that makes people really nervous a lot of times. And a lot of people can be very uncomfortable with that when they see a woman pulling back. And this is where we could see things like gossip, like, what's going on with her? Why isn't she doing that anymore? That's not you. Is everything okay with her? And, I think we really tend to kind of pathologize a lot of these things. And so if you have a friend or if you have a family member and you see some of these changes occurring, I would just really encourage you to get curious about it and to be a good friend, right? And to not jump to any conclusions. And maybe this is an opportunity for you to get to know your friend a little bit better. So I hope you found this helpful. I think that the grief part of this healing is tremendous, again, because on the other side of this, as you're hearing in this post, there's so much transformation, and it starts with like small parts of transformation, small pieces, and it can get bigger. And what's really happening is that we're engaging in a developmental process that really needed to happen when we were in our adolescence and early 20s that got disrupted as a result of the relational trauma. And so we're just kind of having to navigate that now as adults. It can be a little bit messy, obviously, because we now as adults have very significant responsibilities. We might have children, we might have careers, we have mortgages, there's all kinds of things. We have a lot of responsibilities that we have as adults that we didn't have as children, and we're trying to figure out who we are navigating this process. I hope you found this helpful. Thank you again for coming on here and being curious. Have a good rest of the day.